All right, everyone. Hello, welcome back. Happy to have you here as always. I am joined today by another returning guest, actually, one of my favorite traditional witchcraft authors, which actually got quite a few discussion points and questions last time, actually, which was very interesting. Um, which is Kerry Weisner. And he's obviously the author of the Geisha trilogy, The Willow Path, Horn to the Moon, and more recently, The Art, which I am currently reading and is absolutely brilliant. So I thoroughly recommend it. But Kerry, thank you so much for coming back.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
It's brilliant. Yeah, we were just saying before we jumped on the way that this was one of, like, I was rewatching our last podcast, and it was one of my favorite ones to do because it was much more kind of an open, free-flowing chat, which I much more kind of enjoy, especially when it comes to traditional witchcraft. Because there's like one of the things I always find with sort of trad craft is it can be difficult for people to approach it because there's not necessarily a formal tradition, right? It's much more of a living kind of localized tradition that there doesn't necessarily there's not always very strict hierarchies, unless of course you're working in covens and things, right? But it is much more kind of a personal connection, personal sort of philosophy, and you're getting into it, right?
I think so. I think so. I think there's some basic fundamental practices and underlying currents or beliefs, or practices, I guess, where I am, because I don't really think it's beliefs. I
Mm,
think once you get into this, it's a practical art. And so there's an underlying system there that seems to be common among most traditional witches. But
mm,
then from there, it begins to diverge depending on what you're looking at, what you're practicing. So, yeah.
mm. Yeah. So if we were to sort of focus on more, I guess, on your practice, right? So I obviously know a fair amount of your practice from reading your books, whether it's with working with Grandma Julie or I remember reading that you were quite taken with like Sybil Leek's stuff,
Mhm.
and that kind of thing. So can we talk a little bit about or like re-talk, I guess. I think we've already mentioned it in the last one, but just your kind of inroad into how all this all started and things for you.
Wow.
I know it's a big question.
It is. It is. Well, because I've been doing this a long time.
Mm,
I really got involved in magical arts and the occult when I was very young. I was in my very early teens. I want to say 12 or 13, and picked up some books, became utterly fascinated by it. Had some really interesting personal experiences with it, but at the same time, my father, who was separated from my mother, I did not know. He hadn't told anybody. He was a Rosicrucian, and so he started passing me different books, and I eventually ended up moving in with him and living with him. And he really was quite an interesting person. But he passed a lot of different books to me. Some of the earliest ones were Sibilik's book, The Complete Art of Witchcraft. Of course, Paul Huson's Mastering Witchcraft,
mm,
and those really were what brought me got piqued my interest in the whole subject.
mm,
But I got very involved in hypnosis, all kinds of things.
mm.
Eventually, as I grew, I ended up leaving my home and moving to California. And at that point, I began really studying a lot. And there was a lot of information out there at the time. This was the late 70s. And I wanted to learn witchcraft as Sibylle taught it. I really was impressed by her books. I'd read several of hers. So I wrote to her, and little did I know at the time that she was dying, and but she didn't make that public. This was
Sure.
about 79, 78, 79, somewhere in there. But she wrote to me, and she referred me to Isaac Bonowitz, who was very well known in the neo-pagan community. He was not involved in Wicca, but he knew about it. I but anyway, he lived in the area.
Mm,
And so she referred me to him. And actually, it was his wife, oh boy, Celine,
mm,
who invited me up to their home. And I did a few rituals with them, met them a couple times. And Isaac knew Julie. And when he listened to what I was looking for, he felt she would be the best fit. But
mm.
Julie's family wasn't open to taking students, especially anybody outside the family. Hers was
Right.
a closed family tradition. She was very well known in the pagan community, but she claimed to have, and I have no way of knowing if this is true or not, she claimed to have family roots reaching back to the Basque region of Europe, and that her teachings had roots reaching back to that.
Mm,
Uh, But after an interview with her and the entire family, she decided to take me on, but she explained that I couldn't be part of the family unless I married into it. And I wasn't going to do that. Uh, I was, what, 20, 21 years old then? And,
Yeah.
but she took me on, and while she decided to start searching for a group that would be suitable for me. So I studied with her for quite a while. She was very picky, very well known in the community. Um, and in regards to her teachings, I would say that some of the teachings that she had, that she showed me, and I'm sure she didn't show me everything, but she
Mm,
showed me, were unique to her family. I'm almost certain of it. And there's things that I've found in her system that I have begun to find similar practices in certain European groups, which I thought was interesting, but I haven't
mm,
seen the books. But then there's other things that she incorporated. She incorporated some ceremonial magic, some of the Anderson, is that his name? Anderson, Victor Anderson's teachings.
it rings
So
a
she,
bell.
she
Yeah.
was a bit eclectic, but
Mm,
she at her core, she had some personal teachings that, as I look at it after all these years, I think were quite unique.
mm,
She eventually, well, she too, unfortunately, was dying as well. She was dying of cancer. I didn't know it, and but she found a group that she thought was uh, fairly reputable, and this was a Wiccan group,
mm,
Celtic witchcraft. And she introduced me to them, and then she passed on within a few months of me getting initiated into that coven. And I was with that coven for probably 10 years, eventually became the high priest, and decided to leave that group. I felt that I had outgrown it after 10 years.
mm,
And I really kind of stepped back and reassessed where I was at. And that's when I really delved very deeply into ancient Egyptian magic and religion. And I did this through academic texts. I
mm,
really wanted to study what did they actually do? What did the texts themselves say? And what do Egyptologists know about it? But having an occult background, I felt that I would be able to understand the inner workings a little bit more. And I
mm.
worked on that for quite a long time. I'm going to say at least, oh boy, 12, 15 years.
Wow.
And,
Yeah.
amassed quite a library. Ended up starting an online school called Aket Utru, which means the radiant place of Hawthorne, and had quite a few students. Wrote several courses, and have just recently converted those over into book format
Mm,
through Troy Books. Um, it was in the early 2000s that even though I had a strong reading background in Hermetics, I wanted to get involved in Hermetics, and I did not, and not a fan of the Golden Dawn at all.
mm.
It's just too,
I was going to ask, why is that? Yeah.
it's too Abrahamic for me. It's too
Yeah.
Christian
Okay.
oriented, Judeo-Christian, and I'm not saying it's an invalid path. I'm
Mhm.
saying I can't relate to that. I just can't
Right.
relate to that system at all.
Mm,
I very have trouble with the whole monotheistic, patriarchal approach toward the art.
mhm,
Instead, I ended up getting very involved with a group that is called Ogdoadic tradition,
mm,
which is the group I got involved with was very good, very good. And was initiated, made it to the level of adept. I can't recommend it more. I love it.
mm,
I love it. And still a member in good standing, but um, that filled in a lot of the gaps that I was missing in some of my knowledge.
mm,
But what happened was, we live in New Hampshire, in New England,
mm,
and we were very tired of the urban life. We were living in a fairly large city in New Hampshire, and I was doing my hermetics and Egyptian magic in the third floor of our house, an attic, a finished attic, attic that had all been turned into a really nice room.
Right, decked out. Yeah.
Yep, yep. And that was really nice, but we really hated the city. So I and my wife found property in the mountains of New Hampshire, and we're there. We built two cabins, and we have 22 acres. You have to four-wheel drive to get in there.
Mm,
And I found that over the years in working in that system, working in that place,
mm.
something else takes over, something else happens. And a lot of the more ceremonial magic just doesn't fit. It doesn't seem, yeah, it just doesn't fit. It really doesn't.
Interesting.
Well,
Yeah.
what I found was a couple things. One, I started going back to my roots with Julie, looking back at what she taught. And things in traditional witchcraft, there's a lot of talk of familiar spirits, of working with the land, of spirits coming to you, of teaching you. And as unconventional as that sounds in our current era, things began to happen out there. I began to become aware of forces, entities, and it was really quite moving or opening to me.
Yeah.
And what was unique is that because I'd gone through the discipline training in the Hermetic arts, um, a lot of the techniques, not necessarily the actual rituals, but the techniques, the processes, the
Right.
underlining practices and foundations inherent in that Ogdoadic Hermetic system, really gave me the foundation, along with the practical magic that Julie had taught. And Julie was really into keeping it simple, keeping it basic, that your tools are the things you have right there in nature and in your home, instead of having these big, elaborate ceremonial
With
robes.
big consecrations and robes and stuff. Yeah.
Exactly. And it really just opened up everything to me. So I
Mm.
began really going back and looking back at all my notes over the last 50 years and compiling them. And that's how these books came about. And that's how my
Right.
practice came about. So for me to say I'm a traditional, which I am, it's my favorite form. It's what I do. But I would be not representing it clearly if I didn't explain that I also incorporate these other practices that I've gained. The Egyptian, which you can see from the background,
Sure.
the
Yeah. You got the
yeah,
big chairs. Yeah.
the Hermetics. There's a lot there. And
Mm.
so that's why I tend to shy away from the title witch and
Mm.
prefer just to call it the art. It's to me, it's just the arts. It's the
Yeah.
art. Though it's practical magic. What
Mm.
I don't like about Hermetics, here I'm babbling again, but
Okay, we're here for it. Bring it. It's good.
what I don't like about Hermetics is very little that's practical. It's all
Mm.
this developing the inner self, opening yourself up to other realms, getting in touch with higher being, and I hate that term higher,
High and low.
more
Yeah. This
advanced
is,
beings, the HGA, all of this. And that has its place. It helps to develop you inside. But when you lose your job, when there's a recession going on, when you need more money, when you need health, what are you going to do? And traditional witchcraft is very different. Traditional witchcraft was the magic of the common people. It was the rural folk, the cunning folk. If you look back in the history of magic, you look back 100 years, 200, even 300 years ago,
mm.
most people practice some form of charms and spells in their home, in their practices. They wouldn't have necessarily even called themselves witches or anything like that. It was just another tool that they used to survive. Back then, it was all about where am I going to get my next meal? How do I have enough food and fuel for the winter? How do I survive?
Mm.
And so they had these charms, these spells that they did. And it wasn't their custom. It wasn't a cute thing they did. This was done because it works.
Yeah.
It was a tool. It's just like it's time to go out and harvest a field or to slaughter the chickens so you can have your meal tonight. Well, let's get out the talisman, hang it up, and say the chant because we need more prosperity. We need this or that. And that's what I like about traditional witchcraft. It's very practical, it's very real, it works.
Mm.
It's not a quaint superstition. It's lasted in some form or another for literally thousands of years because we've
Yeah.
been practicing magic, since we've been a species,
Hmm.
because it does work, not because it's the culture. Now, you'll find cultural differences depending on where you are in the world or what timeline, what part of history you were in. So the spells, the incantations, the beings will take on the flavor of your culture, but the techniques behind it, underlying it, in my opinion, remain basically, essentially the same. I
Mm.
think it's Stephen Skinner that talks about how magic is a technology, and
Yeah.
I have to agree with him. I have to agree with him completely. It really
Yeah,
is.
absolutely.
So that's kind of a long answer of why traditional witchcraft. And to me, it's my favorite um, because it works, because it works.
Yeah.
It's, and I keep careful journals so that I go, okay, I did this. This is the results. Or I look at something I did and it didn't work. Why not? And so
Right.
it,
It's a very like scientific approach to or maybe it may not even scientific, like just methodological, like experimentation. And you're making notes in the journal. And you're like, okay, well, I did this at this certain time. These are my materials or my materia, and this is the result I got. Let's try again with different things, whatever. And you taking that kind of approach, right?
exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is it religion? How does it differ from Wicca or is it religion? And I don't know how to answer that
It's a hard question.
because where does magic leave off and religion take over?
Yeah.
Both are dealing with otherworld beings,
Mm.
um, and interaction with them. I think the difference is that religion tends to take on a dogmatic format, and it's almost a belief based on faith, whereas magic is not. Magic is you're actually working with these different beings, these different forces. And so it's not faith. It's not dogma. It's an interaction with other realms and beings. And you're going by what works and what doesn't. So I think that's the difference. But that doesn't mean there isn't a spiritual component to traditional witchcraft.
Yeah,
Uh,
this is going to be like kind of my next question actually.
okay,
You're kind of like you're like we're on the same wavelength with this. Like, so like I
okay,
was thinking, but even though we think of traditional witchcraft as being so intensely practical, do you think like I don't I at least in my experience, or at least that isn't necessarily at the exclusion of those higher mysteries, like whether it's the HGA or the inner self work, like the theurgic work, that kind of thing. Like I have found in my own practice that those systems or like avenues towards those higher states of being awakening and those higher states of kind of mysteries and knowing they do exist in traditional witchcraft. You just approach them in a different way.
absolutely, absolutely. Um, Boy, how do I word it? I can think of numerous occasions where I have been out in the forest, in the woods, doing my basic practical magic.
Mhm.
In doing so, you're working with these entities, these beings, and I don't think of any of them as higher or lower, more angelic or less. I hate those terms. I absolutely hate those terms. I
Mhm.
just don't buy into this whole up-down um, linear model. I don't buy that. I think
Mhm.
that's something that we inherited from the Abrahamic and Zoroastric traditions that somehow there's good, and then everything else got the good got mad at the bad and it fell down. And I don't buy any of that. It doesn't make sense.
Mhm.
To me, there's multiple realms, multiple states of being. Each of them are important. Each of them have their place. None is more sacred or less sacred. Yes, there are different realms where beings of a more complex nature than us, who or completely different than us, may be able to manifest or communicate more readily or work more readily than we do. But that doesn't mean that they're higher or better. And so the witch, the traditional witch, or at least the practice that I use, is to be able to interact on these different realms, these different levels, to move through them and to bring that through into your own life. So then when you're doing that, when you're casting that spell, when you're out in that forest and you're interacting with some of these beings, and many of them are, frankly, far older and far more complex, that in itself is because our language, English language, is so limited. For lack of a better word, it's a spiritual experience. I don't know what else to use, what other word we have to use.
Mhm.
It's an experience in which you are evolving and developing and growing in so many different ways, not just materially. So, in that way, in my opinion, the witch murmuring over a candle or over a cauldron is participating in a spiritual practice at the same time that it's practical. That it's not low magic, it's not high magic. And in many ways, I would almost say that she that what she's doing in many ways is probably more realistic, more effective for her spiritual development than the high ceremonial magician in his robes and regalia calling on the archangels and all of this, because she can get results on multiple
Mm.
levels. Can he? Sometimes. I've known some very powerful ceremonial magicians who do, but I've known others that absolutely run away from the idea of affecting the material world with magic. They absolutely are, and which leads me to believe, are they really what they think they are?
Right? Can they actually do it?
Yeah, exactly. And so, well, I don't know. I haven't remember what the question was, but I tend to babble.
Oh, we're good. It's good. Yeah, I like it. Yeah, I mean, it was feature like I guess just featuring into this whole this debate between sort of practical magic and
Yeah,
well, I guess what we can call the higher mysteries and that kind of thing. Because yeah, it's a on a basic level, like if you have the space and stuff to have a very elitist practice in that sense, you have the luxury of having the money to facilitate it and not starve, that kind of thing. You have the space in your house, that's brilliant, and power to you. But as you said, right, at the moment when you lose your job and it's we're in the middle of a recession and everything's going to go into hell, it's a very formal drawn out ritual is not going to help you in that moment, right?
yeah. Well,
Well, it
that's
could,
not been my
but
experience. No,
yeah,
and I've tried it. I have tried it, and it
yeah.
does not there. But you pull out the basics. This root, this candle, this oil. You do your basic magic with the full intent of your will in basic practical magic, and you'll get result. Well, most times you get results. If you know what you're doing, you'll get your
Mm.
results.
Right. Yeah. So it's interesting then. I guess this is like the thought in my head right now is kind of like I don't know, what is it's coming through? Like the anatomy of spellcraft, I guess is like the word that's coming to me. It's like you mentioned will and then herbs and oils and things. So for you in your tradition, what makes up a spell? So like if we were to sort of posit a scenario where we were to make some kind of manifestation, we needed to do something. What's your general kind of approach to ritual, I guess, in this sense?
Well, I think first everything starts inside the person,
Mhm.
and if you don't have this, it's not going to work. You've got to have, first of all, you have to know how to. We'll start with them. First, you have to have a clear idea of what you're going for. It's got to be within your realm of availability. So what I mean by that is, you see a job you want, you can't go for president of the company that you're applying to unless you're fully qualified and you have
Mm.
some kind of in. No spell's going to make that happen.
Mm.
You can sit there and do it, and you might get noticed, but you're not going to get that job, no matter how good a witch or magician you are. Um, so you have to do something that's realistic, practical, within your realm of availability. Availability. You have to also be able in the spell, first of all, to have clear yet relaxed, focused concentration. You have to
Mhm.
be able to visualize it. As the Grand Master of the Order, the Hermetic Order, taught me, he said, and I agree completely, imagination isn't the same as fantasy. We
Mm.
tell ourselves fantasies all the time. We read books, we watch movies, it's all fantasy. Imagination is a faculty of the mind, both to perceive what we would call astral or occult forces, but also to shape those based on our ability to focus and concentrate. So you have to have that strength. Then you have to have, as Siblika explained, you have to have the desire. You have to have the desire to do it. And that means just real passion, to be intimately involved in the task at hand. When you're casting that spell, nothing else exists. Nothing else exists. I'll be really blunt here. It's almost like sex. When
Mhm.
you're having sex, you're not thinking about the past. You're not thinking
Right.
about the future. You're not thinking about what you're going to have for dinner. You're just in that moment, in that passion, that drive, and it's the same thing in a spell. You have to be completely into that goal, manifesting that goal.
Mm.
Then, probably the third and most important thing is intuition, or the ability to merge. As one teacher taught me, she called it merging. Others, I think Sybil used to call it becoming. Gemma Gary talks about it as becoming part of, becoming aware, opening yourself and allow the forces into you and allowing your essence to flow out, to realize you're not a separate entity, to really merge with it. You need all of those elements, so that passion, that drive, that focused will, and that ability to intuitively just merge with the task at hand. That's what's going on inside the witch. The other things, of course, are timing. You have to look at what natural tides there are. And then what objects are you using? What's the goal for, and what objects are you using? And this is a hard one for people to overcome in our current society, 21st century society. It's so hard for people to pick up a bone or a certain herb and say, this is going to make this happen. How is this little herb going to do this? How is this candle really going to affect anything? That's our Western, materialistic, modern conditioning. And what I teach my students is these items don't represent something. They don't correspond to something. They are extensions of greater forces. So when you say this color or this colored candle or this herb corresponds to Jupiter or represents Jupiter, represents my financial success, what the witch should be thinking in her mind or his mind is this resonates with, this is an extension of the same forces that manifest as Jupiter, that manifest as prosperity, that manifest as that aspect or occult influence. It is not separate from it. So when you're doing that spell and you have that item, you have that actual force in your hands. It's so important, at least during the spell, that is what's going on in your mind. This doesn't represent it. This poppet that I have of this person isn't a representation of them. It's them. It's them. This herb that I'm using is not symbolic of success. It is a physical manifestation in this realm of the same force that brings success. You have to think like that. If you don't, you automatically step away from it and your magic becomes harder.
Right, it creates a distance between you and the thing.
So yeah. And then the last thing is once you do this spell, you want it's good to have some kind of a good chant to put yourself into that big state of trance or becoming, and to help build up passion. But something that's in a lot of traditional witchcraft spells that's not in a lot of Wiccan spells is almost all of them appeal to some type of a spirit, whether it's your familiar spirit or some type of entity, and eliciting those. And it's so prevalent in traditional witchcraft, this idea that the world is filled with consciousness, with spirit, with spirits, and that you can call on these. You can, and not in the way that a ceremonial magician does, where he's commanding them, but more as a partner, as a friend, as working with them. In Wicca, you don't see that too much. Usually it's just about raising a bunch of passion and power and yelling out your desires and focusing on it and then letting it go, almost like you're charging a battery. The traditional witch doesn't work that way. She or he will see this as resonating with or an extension of those forces, but also asking those spirits that can help with the projects to work with you. And that's important. Then the final thing that Julie and another teacher taught me is you got to let go. Once you do it, let go. Walk away from it. And that's hard for a lot of people.
Yeah.
They'll go back and say, I wonder if it worked. I wonder if it worked. Don't even think about it. Just forget it. Forget it. Walk away and let it go. So you go, well, how long do I go? And Sybil used to, in her book, said, you may have to wait as much as a full lunar cycle, so 28 days, before you see results. You might see results the very next day, but sometimes it takes time. And I find too, some of the bigger ones that I've worked, I've had to do repeat. And it's what Julie used to call a drum roll. So we would, you do the spell, walk away, let it go, come back a month later, do it again. it's easier to it's harder to build than it is to destroy. If you're doing some type of cursing or blasting, that's going to happen pretty fast.
Mm,
But anything that you're building, it takes time for that to grow. And so it can be that you need to do it more than once.
right.
So don't get discouraged. But
Mm,
those are some of the things that, in my mind, are elements of spell crafting as I've come to understand it and practice it.
right. Yeah, that's really interesting. So I mean, like when you're dealing with like or in this kind of scenario, I guess, and you're picking, say, the herbs, or even picking the timing. So if we're doing a drum roll, for example, and you have to do it again on a certain, whether it's, I assume a certain lunar tide or a certain Cena or season or anything like that. How is it at least in your system? How are you sort of defining the correspondence? How do you like determine correspondences? Like what's kind
Oh,
of what's the philosophical system behind like what belongs to what in this sense?
well, I'm the first thing I look at is the planetary, no, the lunar cycles. That's the first thing. I'm very involved in that. That's
Mhm.
the very first thing. Um, and I don't want to go into too much detail because it's pretty basic material. It's
Mhm.
basically, new moon to full moon, the waxing period. That's when things of a more positive nature or growing nature. I even like that term
Sure.
positive. Things where you're drawing stuff to you can be done more.
Mhm.
Also, it's time if you're building nephesh energy or etheric energy, if you want to use a Victorian term, or in traditional witchcraft, it might be the second skin. If you're working with that serpent power, that energy of the land, and you're building it up, pulling it to you to use toward a goal, that over that 2 week period can build steadily, pretty
Mhm.
rapidly. The full moon for me is always a time. I never let a full moon go by that I don't do some type of ritual,
Mhm.
and that's the time when, in traditional witchcraft, in the Ogdoadic system anyway, nephesh, which is a Hebrew term for that astral energy, the serpent energy that is the strongest, it's the most available. Perfect time for spirit invocation or manifestation is right around the full moon. Astral workings, sending forth the fetch, all of that is very powerful at that time. Um, the waning moon is for getting rid of things, blocking things, protecting things, but it's also excellent for divinations as well.
Right.
Um, I don't, as a rule, do much, if any, negative magic. I hate that term, positive negative. What's the best word? Blasting,
Yeah.
cursing. It's extremely rare that I will do that.
Mm.
Uh, it's not out of fear of the law of three. It's a Wiccan concept.
Yeah.
I don't adhere to that, but it's about being responsible. This is power. It's like owning a gun. Just because you have one doesn't mean you go out and shoot people. You have it for protection.
Mm.
And so, you know, but that's the basics. First is I look at the lunar tides. The second is what time of year is it? What's going on with the solar tide? And so this time of year right now we're in the element. The solar tide is the element of fire. It started with the spring equinox. And then, as Julie taught, and also a couple other people I know, and they teach in the Hermetic order I'm in. With each quarter, a different tide takes over. The next one is water at Cancer with summer solstice,
Mm.
uh, then air with the autumn equinox, and then earth with the winter solstice. But with each of these are different functions. So what's really exciting is as you get toward Cancer, from the summer solstice to autumn equinox, that's when spirit manifestation can be very strong. When you can use that to evoke different type of entities or deities to visible form, if you have that skill set, it's an excellent time for prosperity, abundance. So let's say it's what time of year is it right now? We're in late spring. It's in the northern hemisphere.
Mm.
Um, you want to do a spell for prosperity and abundance, you're going, well, the solar tide is good because
Mhm.
the energy of the land is growing and slowing now. We're heading toward a time when that serpent power, that raw astral energy is strongest. And then you would look at the moon and go, okay, I want to do it during the waxing moon. If I go nearer to the full moon, I'm going to have more power available. But if I want to build up over a period of time, say a drum roll, you
Mhm.
might do one shortly after the new moon, again, another one just before the full moon. Um, and then I look a lot at the planetary days and hours. I do.
Mhm.
I don't know how many people do that. Actually, several traditional witches do, but I'll look at that, and I will even time it out to that. Now, you ask my wife, who's very involved in all this. She doesn't do any of that.
Mm.
She's very powerful though. She has to be in the right mindset, but if she's there, she just does it. She just does it. She just gets out her stuff and does it.
Mm.
And where I think because of my training and over years and years of doing it this way, this is the system I follow and that I teach to my students. So
Mm.
that's some of the stuff I do.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting as well. So I guess if we're focusing on the moon, I guess for a second here, and this sort of had a nice segue into something else I want to talk about that you mentioned in Horns of the Moon, which is the ladies of the moon, and how these kind of factor into whether it's the timing or certain material, certain rites, and this kind of thing. So people who are not familiar with I want to say your system, but I assume like it's not entirely your own system. You're getting it from the inspirations, but for those who aren't familiar with the systems of the ladies in the moon, can we compare it to say the lunar mansions, for example?
So the lunar mansions, largely an Arabic system based on the zodiacal sign that the moon is traveling through.
Mhm.
And I've have experimented with that, and it is used extensively in a lot of Hermetic groups. Uh,
Mhm.
and I know of, oh, I can't remember. There's a couple books by some excellent people where they have talismanic magic that works specifically with those.
Mhm.
Uh, I've never really, I didn't have a lot of success with it. It just didn't fit. Either I didn't have the right mentality or didn't approach it properly. I'm not saying it's not valid. I know that I think as Agrippa talks about the dimensions of the moon as well. Um, Instead, what because of what Julie taught, what I've learned from some people, the phases of the moon, specifically Sibylle in her book Cast Your Own Spell, she talks a lot about the actual phases of the moon and the different effects as you go through each week or whatever.
Mm.
And I have a strong astrological background. I've studied a lot of study in astrology. And I began realizing, well, the phases of the moon really are the angle that the moon is making to the sun as she travels through the month. It
Mm.
doesn't have anything to do with the zodiacal sign that it's in. Rather, it's more that position between the sun and the moon. And so you're talking about astrological aspects and influences. And so what I did was, and I have with my students, is we looked at each day, what angle is it? And this also takes into account some of the teachings that I have in the Willow Path regarding the different worlds or realms that
Mm.
exist. And then as the moon moves through these, and so with each day, there's a different influence and each that you can tap into or tide of power. And it's pretty, it's term I want to use, subtle. It's not real a strong difference as one day flows into the next and onward. But if you start looking over a period of time, you'll see that what's happening a week later is very different influence than what was happening the week before. But it's a very gradual process. And so what I've come to do is I'll look at each day and okay, where are we at on this spectrum? And how can I tap into that? And I found, at least for I and my students, that that seems to work very well. So that's how that what came about. It is a mix of different magical arts put together because I figured out astrologically where each angle is, but also looking at the phases based on some of the things that Sybil taught, that Julie taught, and then incorporating all of this into it.
Mm.
So that's kind of where that came from.
Mm. So when we're, I guess, conceptualizing the ladies of the moon in a sense, like how do we conceptualize them as like angles of the moon to the sun, or would you conceptualize each independent lady as its own spirit and its own consciousness that you can interact with?
If you ever look at the Egyptians, they
Mm.
had different ladies for each hour of the night and
Mm.
day, and they saw them as uh, specific beings that represented the journey of Ra through the different worlds. This is essentially the same thing.
Mhm.
It really is. And I drew some inspiration from that as I did this. So, because in the magical arts, as I understand it, everything literally is consciousness, in my opinion. If you change your state of consciousness, you change your state of being. And so I'm going to say that consciousness forms pools of identity, and that becomes separate beings, but they're all part of this consciousness. Just like
Mhm.
you and I are an entity, but we're a pool of consciousness. We're part of the greater whole. And if you change your state of consciousness, you can merge with, or at least tap into, these other beings and levels. So you could say that these ladies of the moon for each day represent just a different consciousness or a different approach, a different force. Yet are they individual and unique and sentient? Quite possibly. I can't say that for sure. I can't say that one day the lady of the lady of the seventh day of the moon came to me in some vision. That hasn't happened. No, because I've had those kinds of experiences out in the forests and in my rituals where beings have come to me.
Mm.
But I can't say that about these. But am I going to say it's that they're not? I don't know. I'm not going to lie about it. I don't. I honestly do not know. All I know
Sure.
is it works.
Yeah. Yeah. The main thing you need to know, I guess, in that sense. So in that sense, again, are these, is this a system of things that you can form a relationship with each of these ladies in this sense, or is it more just kind of tides that you observe
Right
for?
now, I would say,
Yeah.
for me personally, now I haven't tried to form any kind of relationship. To me, they represent tides of power. They
Mm.
they are the tides of power, just
Yeah.
put into a conceptual a form that I can relate to, that we can relate to. Um, yeah, that would be the best way to explain it.
Yeah. Okay. So in that sense, then when you're, how does that differ then from when you are out in the land, so doing your rituals, and you are forming a relationship with a conscious entity, for example?
In those situations, almost always it was something almost unlooked for.
Mm.
Almost always, you. I think I discuss it in. I think I do in Horns of the Moon. A good example. How do I want to word this? I don't want to go into, well, why not? I'll go into a little bit of a long story.
The
We had moved out into the forest. We had just gotten up there. This was about 15, a little more longer than that, maybe 17 years ago. And it's literally a full 2 miles from the nearest of anybody, nobody else around.
mm.
And you have to four-wheel drive to get up to this place. I and my wife, we built our own cabin by hand. Um, Cut our own wood, everything. But though we had a kit, actually, we brought in of from a cabin made kit that we brought in each board and put it in. But then we cut all the trees, everything else around the land. But we started having a series of bad luck, things going wrong, equipment not working right. It was weird. It was really weird, and we started realizing, and we started hearing voices in the forest. And I'm dead serious. I'm dead serious about this. We
Mm.
weren't looking for this. There were voices. There were things that were happening, and we realized, I'm going, okay, somebody doesn't want us here. Somebody's not happy with this process that we moved into their place,
Mm.
and um, we even started seeing things forms in the trees just out of the corner of your eye. And so I decided the best thing to do would be a series of rites. One, um, out in the woods, to just say, "Hey, we're here," and to give a little offering to them. And I described the rite in the book as something I made, but it's based on traditional witchcraft sigils and forms found in books going back 300 plus years. And then I decided to do some traveling in spirit, or what we would today call astral projection.
Mm.
But the idea was to go into the forest in that state of being and see if I could encounter them and talk to them. And so I didn't know what I was going to encounter. I really didn't. So I went in that form. This is after doing some of the rituals. And I encountered one form that frankly was some kind of a guardian form.
Mm.
And this being was not going to let me pass until I explained that I wanted to meet with whoever was their leader and just talk to them, explain that we were there, we didn't mean any harm, we wanted to be stewards of the land. Um, and this being, and I described the being in the book, but it was something I've never seen before, and it let me pass. And again, you could say this is all subjective. I'm just going to tell you the story.
Sure.
And I followed this trail in my astral or spirit form around a hill. And on top of the hill, by the way, is where we ended up building our uh, ceremonial circle. But
Mm.
followed it around this trail, and I got to a certain point, and there was a small stone table set up. And this is all in the astral vision. Okay.
Right.
Um, but there was a lady, and entirely cloaked in red, a hood, just you could not see the face. You could tell there was some kind of light coming from underneath the hood, and um, there was a communication. I
Mm.
can't say it was words, but there was a communication. And she she seemed so much more so older, but not old. I mean, something that was ancient or part of the land, but not like an old crone or anything. It was more just something of a different order of being, a more complex order of being than I was. And I remember distinctly that she called me a walk around the land. And the impression was that I was somehow temporary, that I was somehow very fleeting, which was very humbling because here she was, she seemed like she was ancient, like she was the force in the land. But
Mm.
it was a very formal but cordial uh, interaction. And I explained why we were there and that we wanted to just be there to live our lives and to be stewards of the land. We weren't going to tear the place apart. We were there to protect it from other people. Um, and then there was more to the experience, but I won't go into it. But
Cool.
eventually,
Yeah.
I ended up back in my body. So later, I went back up there, and so to answer your question, I wasn't looking. I didn't know what I was going to find, and I
Mm.
found here's this weird guardian. He had multiple horns, not two horns like you would have thought, and multiple horns. And it was a really odd looking character. And
Mm.
uh, then this woman or this being, all dressed cloaked in red, that you never really saw. Um, but when I went there, I found a trail that went around the side of the hill that I didn't know was there. I assume it was a deer path, but it could have been something else. And you follow it, and you get around to the spot where that table was, and there was a series of flat rocks, all laid flat on the ground, like they'd just been dropped there. And
Mm.
one was standing straight up, but it just begged to be put up. I ended up setting up the table just like with those rocks, just like was in the vision.
Mm.
It was in the exact spot. And so um, since then, all the misfortune, all the weird events stopped. They all stopped. And so I've built a small, in that spot, I've built a small spot dedicated to her.
Mm.
Uh, Dug out a little hollow in front of the standing stone and lined it with quartz crystals, white ones that we found on the land, all part of the land. And I
Mhm.
take offerings there. But if you go up to the top of the hill, there's a clearing, and we've built a large stone circle up there. And that's where we do our rituals.
Yeah.
So to answer your questions, that was something where these beings came across as very real, sentient, independent, conscious entities of a very different nature than me. It wasn't something that I'm going to make this visualize this or whatever. It wasn't nothing like that.
Mm.
And since then, I've had several interactions with her, and it's been a very fulfilling friendship, I'd say.
Mm.
So that's the difference too between the witch and the magician. The magician would stand in a circle and sit there commanding and forcing things into a triangle, where the witch goes out and becomes familiar with these spirits and learns from them and works with them and becomes neither is superior or we're just different. So that compared to the Ladies of the Moon is more of that was one where I actually said, okay, the moon's in this spot on this day. Astrologically, it forms this aspect. It's going to have this influence. Sybil says that on this during the week after the full moon, this is when this is the strongest. I calculated all that out. And that
Right.
was, but the other stuff is
It's different. Yeah. So I mean,
yeah.
it's interesting. It's like, do you think she was like this entity? Do you think she was like a local spirit, or do you think she was like a like I guess what we could say in more traditional things like the Queen of Elfame, for example, something like that? Like, do you think she was more of a local entity, or more like a
No, I've wrestled with this question for a while, and I don't know. What's
mm,
interesting is why the red cloak and
mm,
why the red cloak. And as I dug into historical records, you find that in Ireland, parts of England, back in the 1800s, possibly over the 1800s, a lot of the cunning women um, wore red cloaks. It's the
mm,
weirdest thing.
mm,
And I didn't know that. I had no idea, but you'll find that quite a bit. And then another thing is, I was reading, as I read constantly, I was reading a book about a gentleman who had gotten totally disgusted with society. And he ended up in Maine, which is about 200 miles from here, which isn't far. In New England, that's not far.
mm,
But he was a hermit and lived up in the forests of Maine for 20 some odd years, living, and nobody knew he was there. And he finally came out because they found him or whatever. But he talked about some of his experiences. And he talked about one time when he almost died. It was the middle of winter. And he was, he basically was freezing to death. And he recounts an experience in which a hooded woman came to him and said, "You can either stay or you can come with me." And he said he so badly wanted to go with her, but he decided to stay and he survived the winter.
mm,
To this day, he says he regrets that he didn't go with her. And when I read it, because the rest of the book's all very materialistic, and
mm,
this one spot, this mystical experience, I went, wait a minute, there's this lady. He didn't say what kind of cloak, what color, but I'm going, isn't it odd that this happened in the forest in New England with him?
right.
So is she a local spirit? Would she be considered a local goddess? If this was Europe 300 years ago, would they have thought it was some kind of, I don't know. I don't
Mm,
know. She's very ancient, just a sentient being that's part of the land.
mm.
And, am I going to say it's the goddess? Is it? I just don't know. I hate to use terms
Right.
like
It's kind of semantical, like whether it's important or not. So because like you had the experience and it was emotionally moving and things for you, and that's what really matters, I guess, in this scenario, right?
yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting to think about, and I guess as well, like on that note, on the difference between, I guess, like old craft in like New England, I guess, as opposed to like in England. 'Cause, like we can conceptualize things like local spirits as fairies or part of the fairy tradition, that kind of thing. But and I assume when you're in New England or the States in general, like you have your own, like whether it's you draw from like local native folklore and things like that as well. Like, is there a similar kind of terminology that we have? Because
There is.
I'm useless in native folklores.
There is quite a bit. What's interesting is the local Abenaki, I'm probably saying that name wrong, Native Americans
Mm,
uh, talk quite a bit about spirits in the land and the spirits of nature. Um, I actually talk about it in Horns of the Moon. I give the name of them. I can't say it, but it's there. And so there is that same or similar belief or practice that there are these beings present. And why not? I mean, you have bears all over the world. You
sure.
have different types of animals that exist. Why couldn't these other types of beings? What I
Mm,
will say is that I have had encounters with other entities that are, in my opinion, spirits of the land, and which I would equate very closely to the Shay or the Fae of England and Ireland, but are they the same? I don't think, I don't know. I really
mm,
don't know, but I'll use the same terms.
yeah.
I do it in the book, Horns of the Moon, and I'll use a lot of the sigils that were used in some of those old books, and they were.
Mm.
So I'm going to say the technology works. There's something here. So
Mm.
just like humans are spread out all over the world, I'm assuming
Yeah,
the
we can make it
sigils.
it's a fairly safe assumption, I think, that spirits are, at least local land spirits, wherever, they're all over the place. Same as humans, absolutely. Well, yeah, I guess on that note then as well, you mentioned sigils. That's another interesting thing that comes to mind. So, I mean, how do sigils, I guess, factor in your practice? And are you using them as like in a similar way to, let's say, Goetia, where you have certain sigils for certain spirits that you work with, or certain currents of power in the sense of like voodoo vevés and things like that? How do they usually feature?
Of course, there's a difference between sigils and pentacles,
Hmm,
talismans, all of that. I do
absolutely.
a lot. I do a lot with those, all of that. To me, a sigil is an extension or concentration of the spirit that it corresponds to, not unlike your own signature. You have to, when you sign a contract, it's not just your mark. You're extending your will. You're saying, yep, I am going to do this, or I agree to this.
Hmm,
That's your signature is really an extension of you, and it's you really boiled down into a concentrated form. That's why a signature makes a fantastic, in my opinion, tag lock. It really
right.
does.
It's like handwriting and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so when you use a sigil, a valid sigil from a certain spirit, it's not representing them. It is an extension of them. It is them in a concentrated form. And what's really interesting, I think I talk about it in Horns of the Moon. Is it Horns of the Moon? I can't remember anymore.
I know you talk about it in the art, definitely sigils. It might be in the art.
Yes. But we talk. But what's interesting is that some experiments done at Stanford, was it Stanford University in remote
The
view.
remote viewing stuff. Yeah. Hmm.
Yes, that was really intriguing to me. The fact that they would start drawing just a line or that represented, or while they were in, I shouldn't say in spirit, in that mode of thinking,
Hmm.
visit whatever place it was that they hadn't been to, they started drawing just a symbolic image. But that became kind of the sigil of that place. And literally in the experiments, somebody could put a pen down in a certain spot and tell you what was going on in that one spot in that one place compared to the whole overall. And so, in my mind, a sigil is extremely similar to that. It is it really is a condensed um, extension of or form of that spirit or being that's coming through.
Hmm. Yeah. So how do you make use of them in that sense? Then do you
So
draw
there
them
been
like, on parchment or in the ground, in the dirt, or
all of the above.
yeah, okay, sure.
I'm terrible though at drawing, so I will usually draw them in advance because
Hmm,
to sit there with candlelight going and all that, which if you look at all the books that say you're supposed to be doing it that way, I'm
sure.
just not that good. I'll have an eraser out and go, oh, I got that wrong. I will go and I will draw them out mechanically as best I can,
Mhm.
and then I will use them in the ritual that way. Now, sometimes in nature, I will just sit there with my staff, my stang, or a wand. I will trace them in the dirt. I have oftentimes used something. Like flour, or I do a lot of chainsawing here. I cut my own firewood, and
Oh
I
yeah,
have,
if you're in the forest, yeah,
yeah, and I've taken the sawdust and traced the sigils on the ground using that.
that's interesting. Yeah,
And it's
okay.
been very effective.
Hmm.
So, but again, the idea is it's used as a means of opening that path between this realm and another realm. It's
Hmm.
used as a means of opening that connection to that force, being, or entity you are working with. Some of these talismanic images aren't necessarily tied to a specific spirit. They can be more a manifestation of that tide of power or that process that you're making happening. So one symbol that I use a lot of, and I hate the term symbol,
Hmm.
but is the transformation or terrification of silver, terrification of the moon. And I think where it is, it's in here somewhere. but I use it a lot in my workings because it really does represent that the concentration of the moon. Is this it? There it is. No, no, it's not real clear, but there it is.
Oh yes.
That a lot in our working. I was taught that symbol, frankly, and some people that were practicing Strega. That's where I
Okay.
picked it up, but I've since found it in alchemical works going back several hundred years because I wondered where did they get it? Because everything that was back in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s that these people showed me this. So, but I thought, where did they get it? And the only place I could find is some alchemical works,
Mm.
workings. But I use that a lot, but that doesn't necessarily represent a specific entity or deity. It really represents the process of taking the concentration of the moon and putting its essence into whatever you're working with. So I use that symbol a lot. So you'll see different sigils can be used for a variety of things, um, which leads to the pentacles. I have a lot of pentacles in that book, and those really are meant to be functioning tools that manifest those forces in this realm for your use. So a subtle difference between a sigil and a pentacle.
Mm.
A sigil is their signature. That's their manifestation. This is almost a concentration of their force to manifest in a specific way for you in this realm. And that's what those pentacles are used for. So you'll have so many different ones. And you'll see in a lot of those my books, I draw from all ancient sources, ancient meaning pre-industrial on, and some
Cool.
before.
Mhm.
So it's a few hundred years to several hundred years old. I draw from multiple sources, and you'll see some that come directly from the Key of Solomon. And I picked and chose out of there because I'm using practical magic. I'm not doing Solomonic magic. I'm doing very practical magic. And I specifically took out a lot of the mottos that were written in Hebrew around them, took those off because
Mhm.
I just can't relate to it. And I think the real power from my practice is in the sigil itself, not in the motto.
Mm.
Now, that doesn't mean you have to follow my direction. You don't have to. If it
Cool.
works, if you can relate to and understand and function well with that Judeo-Christian approach, then by all means use it. But I pull from several sources.
Mm.
I'm always scouring old manuscripts, always.
Yeah. It's a good, yeah, it's a good method. It's a good method to do it, isn't it?
Yes, it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, yeah, it gives you some really interesting insights. So, I mean, when you kind of have a sigil, I guess on paper or on parchment or anything, and how do you generally activate them or like make them ritually sort of effective? Are we anointing them with certain oils? Are we
Yeah.
visualizing certain things?
And the ritual, I put the
Names, maybe?
ritual in the art that I follow. It's
Hmm.
pretty basic, but yes, I can't remember the exact. I'd have to pull it up. But yes, we do activate them afterwards. It's not just drawing them, and there it is. We do activate them.
Yeah.
And it'll be during specific tide of power related to what you're trying to accomplish.
Hmm.
One of the key things that I do is we call it the charged breath, where once you have done the purifications over it and traced over it, usually with your fey, your wand. Then there's a series of things called where you'll form a triangle, usually with your fingers like that, and
Hmm.
form it over it. And so this item usually is sitting in a triangle bar on your hearth or your altar, and you've already purified it, cleansed it. You've called on the spirit that it corresponds to, or the force that it corresponds to, and then here's where all those elements that I talked about at the beginning of spell magic, that passion, that desire, that clear focus, that merging all come together. But a large part is pulling energy into yourself and holding it deep into your stomach, your midsection,
Hmm.
and visualizing it as you breathe out, flowing down through the arms and out and also out through your mouth as you breathe through the triangle into or onto the object. And as you do, you see the energies flowing into that talisman, into that object, and just glowing with power. Now, again, I'm saying see. What I mean is you're imagining, but
Sure.
again, imagination is not fantasy. Imagination is the faculty of the mind that directs the power.
Mm.
And that's a step that we use, and I've found to be extremely effective.
Mm.
Uh, Now, I know of other techniques where you would just hold your palms over it and visualize the energy flowing out through the palms. That's done a lot in Agdoadic magic, it's done in Egyptian magic. But the charged breath is also something that it can be used. And that's a technique that's often used on in the art of fascination when you're influencing people. If you
Mm.
can get close enough to just lightly breathe on somebody, that charged breath, you can really make a major change in their thinking. So
Mm.
that's
Interesting.
that's a
Yeah.
whole other subject. That's a
Yeah, absolutely.
I
Yeah.
have a chapter of that in the book too. Is for the art of fascinations. So
Yeah. Interesting to think about. Absolutely. So I guess if we're talking about sigils that are on paper, in that sense, if we are, when you're, say, speaking an incantation, or maybe a better analogy would be like saying a name of power, for example, we can kind of consider them almost like sonorous sigils, right? Or like verbal sigils in their own way.
I think of them as magical formula
Mm.
and
Okay.
as a way of manifesting your intention and that connection to that force. Um, yeah, it's a big subject when I talk about names of power and words of power. As it was taught to me specifically in Hermetics, as I was taught, is, or if you look at Crowley, Crowley said it best, and I think I quote him in the book. Um, which book was that? I can't remember. It was maybe it's the Willow Path, but if you look up Crowley, he says you want to basically, I'm paraphrasing here, but you want to build up that passion, desire, till you get ready to say that word, and the word should almost erupt spontaneously from you in that one burst of desire and passion. So when you're saying that word, it's not just the word, it's everything. It's your whole desire encapsulated in that one moment and being coming out and being made manifest through the word. And I know Sibylline was very, very big, especially in her book, Cast Your Own Spell. She talked about being word perfect in what you say in a spell because words are things. They really are clear representations of the desire and thought. So if you mumble, are verbose, um, or you don't state clearly what you want, that energy can be misdirected or can manifest in other ways. So when you go to words of power, what do you use? What can you use? If you look at my book, I use a lot of Egyptian words. I use some Gaelic words, and I do that because I use words that are not common, my common language.
Mm.
And I really tried to draw on the egregore of, I hope I said that right, the ancient essence of the words that were used for literally thousands of years. So many people over those years and those cultures use them to represent a specific thing. So when we use those, you're tapping into that same current of power. And if you have that desire that Carly talked about, and your word perfect the way Sybil talked about, and you just put that out there, that becomes, in one sense, a manifestation of that power in this realm. Now, having said that, you can use them in chants, in incantations to call powers to you, to help put you into that state of being, of merging or becoming. And that can be very, very potent. One of my favorite is Anil Nathrak Banjia Galak Dariat De Neme. And you just say that over and over. And essentially what that was it's Gaelic or Irish Gaelic for serpent's breath, mistress moon, this enchantment I make.
Mm.
And I use that a lot when in virtually every ritual to just start building up the power, to
Mm.
pull in that serpent's breath of the land, to pull in that energy from the moon, to bring it up and let it circulate, and you'll feel it. You'll feel this energy begin to, almost like a fog or a mist, to start circulating around the room, around the area you're working as you bring it in, and then you start pulling it into yourself. Then you call on your spirits, if you have a familiar you're working with, and then finally you can get right down to the spell itself and work it.
Mm.
That's a step that I think a lot of witches don't always follow.
Mm.
So
Yeah, because it's interesting. Like one of the things that like strikes me as you're describing it, like the when you're building that kind of power, like it's coming, it's not like funneled into one area. It's coming up from the entire land around you, right? So you're completely immersed and surrounded. Whereas, like in my mind, if I'm thinking of like a Wiccan ritual, for example, where you're doing circle workings, like you funnel it into like the cone of power, whatever. So it's like a very localized area. But with this, when you're building the energy, it's coming all around you, right? So it's not funneled in some kind of way.
well, that's the interesting. That's some of the differences between traditional witchcraft and Wicca, is that this is about forming that connection with the land, pulling those energies from the sky, the land, the earth, and just letting it gather around you, calling the spirits to you. And something that's really interesting too is in many traditional witchcraft circles, if you want to call it that, treading the mill, whatever you want to call it, they'll work widdershins or
Mm.
twathel. And of course, if you look at Wicca, that's all black magic or for
Right.
banishing. But for the traditional witch, all that is you're working moonwise. The moon travels that opposite direction. When you look each day from in the northern hemisphere, anyway, I don't know the south. I'd have to think about that.
Mm.
But if you're looking at it in relation to the sun, she's moving a little bit farther, farther, farther to the left. And this we call it moonwise. And what I found is for decades, I would only work Deosil only.
Mm.
But then I started, I kept reading about this, and Sybil, in all of her books, she does everything Widdershins. And so I started experimenting with it. And what you're going to find, what I found anyway, is that instead of a constraining barrier that a Deosil circle creates, a Widdershin circle expands. It opens up. The horizon is the most amazing thing. You'll feel the horizon just open up before you. And it encapsulates or encompasses and calls those forces that are there to you. So I wouldn't use it as a protective circle so much, though I know people who do. But if you're doing something where you're going out into the forest, into the land, you're pulling up, calling on these spirits, it helps to do that.
Mm.
And so I've done that. So I will work with both. I will work with both. But that's why in the Willow Path, you'll see I have three circles. One starts as Deosil, the next is Twathel, and then the inner one is Deosil. But the whole idea is you're creating that circumference of protection, then you're expanding out to call the spirits that you want, and then finally you're concentrating it in that one spot.
Mm.
I don't know how I got on that subject. I have no clue.
It works though. It's great. I love it. Yeah.
I babble a lot.
It's great. No, I love it. Yeah. So I mean, as you're, I guess, well, yeah, because we call it like the treading the mill, plowing the furrow, whatever it is, or like doing the kind of the dance, whatever, around the circle, that kind of thing. I assume you're calling spirits, or you're sort of incensing and that kind of thing as well, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like to use incenses that come from the land
Mhm.
for several reasons. One is from the land.
Sure.
I'm really trying to relate to the land. But then I often thought, you look at these old grimoires, and they call for these exotic foreign ingredients from the Middle East.
Mm.
You're a country which out in colonial America or over in Ireland or England in 1600, persecutions are going on. You don't have access to this.
Mm.
You're going to use what's available to you in your place, in the land there.
Right.
And so that's why I try to do that. Now, we live in a cool age right now where right now I can get on Amazon and I can
Sure.
order anything.
Mhm.
So you can order all those exotic ingredients. And
Mhm.
do I? Yes, I do, because I want to also follow that. But if I can go out and find it out my front door and use it. Take some pine resin right off the tree, take a certain root and dry it and grind it up. It's just that much better because it's part of this land, and that's the energies I'm working with.
Mm.
Uh, so, but I do
Yeah.
use a lot of incenses and oils. Yeah.
Mm. That also rings a bell for me actually. For something that I've been reading into a lot in like the PGM, so the Greek Magical Papyri and things, where they have specific procedures for harvesting herbs. You know, like you offer like a prayer to the herb, you speak to the herb, you scatter some offerings. Like, so is there something like that in your tradition, in this scenario, where like you have a certain way of picking the herb, like that kind of thing?
I just try to be respectful,
Right.
and I never take the whole thing. Never,
Mm.
unless unless it's a root. But I won't take the whole colony. I make sure if it's the only plant, I'm not going to take it.
Mm.
Uh, no, I try to be respectful.
Yeah, it will be very ecological. Yeah.
Yeah, but and I'll often leave gifts, a little bit of wine or something
Mm.
in exchange, because I'm absolutely convinced that there are spirits in the land in the place, and I made a pact with them. I made a covenant that I was going to help protect that, that I was going to respect it, and I don't want to go through what I did when I first moved up here.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
so I try to be very respectful of it, and so far things have worked well. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, so I mean, we're coming, I guess, towards the end. I guess that we
Wow.
can start running. We've been like going for like an hour and a half, I think, soon. Um, well, one of the last things I guess I'd like to talk about very briefly then is this idea of, I guess, the witchcraft tradition. You know, the continuity of the tradition as
Sure.
well. Like how, because you've come into this largely, whether it's been training through Hermetic orders or you come into it through a family system, right?
Mhm.
And we always have this kind of it's always a big debate over whether there is a witch cult or anything like the big hypothesis that was generally thrown out, that kind of thing. But there is there's a danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, I
Yes.
think. You know, so how does this idea of kind of the lineage of past witches, I guess, fit into your paradigm or your practice in this sense?
It depends.
Mm.
What I'm going to say is I know there's been a lot of academics recently within the past 20 years that have tried to say that it just didn't exist, that Gardner pretty much made it up. Um, we know that's not true. I mean, there's so much evidence available now. We know that there were cunning folk. We know there were people like practicing this art. So then the argument is, well, yes, but they actually were taking Catholic traditions and things like this and turning it into magic. There was an element of that. Of course there was. But there is more than enough evidence to show that from very early on, from the beginning of the Christian era on, they were constantly in contact with or come across people that were practicing in rural places. And constantly there are references to various goddesses, moon worship, right up into the 1800s. And there's an account I read not long ago of two gentlemen in 1860 in England. I think it was England. I wrote it in my book where it's the Sunday after the first Sunday of May, which would technically potentially correspond to Beltane.
Mhm.
And they come across a group of women out at a well who have lifted their skirts up and they're naked, and another woman is sitting at the well scattering water on them as they dance in a circle. Now, how is that Christian? Tell me, I cannot figure that out. That
Mm.
sounds as pagan as you can get.
Yeah.
I mean, that is not Christian. These academics say, well, it's just they're mimicking what the was said under torture. No, that's not it doesn't fit. That
Mm.
doesn't fit. You can't explain certain accounts like that. And there's many accounts similar to this. Accounts of the women going out on the heaths on Thursdays and Friday nights, and no men allowed, going out and doing magic. You have the Distaff. What is that? I've got the book in the other room. The Distaff uh, Gospel. And a gentleman was allowed to sit in with these folks, these women in France. And it was largely them just sitting around talking and gossiping. But then they started passing spells around, and they're in this book. And this is from the 16 or 1700s.
Mm.
So what I'm saying is, we know there were Hermetic magicians, schools taught in universities in Toledo and Prague. We know that they formed schools. People are social creatures.
Mm.
Why wouldn't people out in rural communities who still had some of the old pagan customs, no matter how old, why wouldn't they also be forming small groups and doing this stuff? Why wouldn't they? And I think there's enough evidence to strongly suggest it. Now, I can't say that I found the proof, but what
Sure.
I point out in that book is in the book The Art, there was a story recounted by a folklorist in Cornwall of talking about people going out into rural places and conducting initiations and performing magic. This was in 1880 that this guy wrote this down.
Mm.
Sybil Leek claimed to have a family tradition. She was born in 1917. So you're talking, what is it, 27,
I mean, yeah, it's only
27 years
by
later? It's a
20. Yeah.
generation.
Yeah.
It's, Julie claimed the same thing, and she was born about 10 years later. Why couldn't it be?
Mm.
So is there a lineage? If there is, it's been broken and scattered. It's had a lot of stuff mixed in. I seriously doubt that there's a specific coven that's lasted for 300, 400 years. I
Sure.
mean, even today, covens come and go, but the core teachings, beliefs, practices, I do think form a pattern and have extended over generations.
Mm.
Now, having said all that, doesn't matter. I mean, really doesn't
Right.
matter. I
Yeah.
mean, today, I can buy a book on all kinds of stuff. I can grasp all this knowledge from the internet. I can start practicing and working with it on my own. We're in an incredible age where the technology is there, not just the technology to find it, but learning the techniques behind practical magic and how do I apply it in my life today. And I think the real focus is not was there a lineage, but what do we do? What do we do now? How do we make this grow? It's not unlike medicine. I
Mm.
mean, doctors don't say, "Well, I can reach my stuff all the way back to the Greek so and so." They don't do that. They're looking at, okay, here's what we know. Here's what we found out what works. This one doesn't work. This works better, and that's how we should be approaching the art. How we should be approaching magic. Not, geez, my lineage is older, this or that. It's more, does it work? Are you getting the material, emotional, and spiritual satisfaction out of this that is aiding you at this point in your evolution? That to me is that's the test of real witchcraft. It's the test of real magic.
Mm.
So I'll get off my soapbox.
Yeah, well, no, it's true, right? Even if you go back to say the Cornwall like the
Yeah.
old Pellers and stuff, like they made a living through magic. They took clients, and
Did.
they wouldn't have repeat customers if it wasn't working. You know?
Well, that's it. It had to. This stuff wouldn't have lasted. It would not
Yeah.
have lasted if it didn't work. And I think that's where, as you said, sometimes I think we throw the baby out with the bathwater. I do think that the feminine tends to be demonized and pushed down. I think there is clear evidence of feminine entities and beings being a big part of traditional witchcraft.
Mhm.
And even today, a lot of traditional witches don't acknowledge that and
Mm.
don't understand that. But our practice, we do. We work a lot with female deities and entities. So,
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds like a good place to leave it, I think.
okay.
So, I mean, in that case, is there anything you want to share about what you're up to at the moment? I guess before we take off, I know you
Sure.
just released The Art, which I thoroughly recommend everyone listening. You need to go read it. It's an excellent book. And in fact, just the whole trilogy in general, so Horns of the Moon and The Willow Path are excellent. They've been very instrumental for me. But is there anything you're currently working on right now? Or like, what's the
Sure.
like next plans with the Geisa trilogy or anything? Was it? I guess
Well,
so.
as part of the Gyesa trilogy, I'm working on another book, which is really a formulary of all the uses of herbs incenses, bones, minerals, things that I found useful over decades. I didn't even know where I picked up all this stuff. I have piles of notes, and I'm compiling that into a book. That's out coming out. I don't know when it's coming out.
Hmm.
I'm working on that. But I also just through Troy Books came up with Eye of the Sun, which is my the correspondence courses that I had built up in the 90s and early 2000s on Egyptian magic, and the advanced course, which is going to be coming out through them, which is Song of Hathor. And
Hmm.
they're really in depth about pharaonic Egyptian magic, not the Greek papyri, but older. Those are Eye of the Sun is out now, and Song of Hathor is has gone to the editor now to be gone through and proofed it. So those are some of the projects. I've got more in the works I would like to share, but I'm just always researching and writing and just trying to get this stuff out. A
Hmm.
big one I'm working on too is I'm looking at the Splendor Solis alchemical series, and
Hmm.
um, I see it as a pictorial, almost grimoire. And I've been going through that piece by piece, painting by painting, and finding the symbolism as I understand it. And so
Hmm.
that's another book I'm working on. So
That
I'm
sounds
just
amazing. It's fascinating. Yeah. I
yeah.
can't wait.
Yeah, I just am fascinated by the whole subject. So
Yeah, it's really interesting that there's so yeah, someone needs to write I don't know, a traditional witchcraft take on alchemy. I would definitely read that. That's a very I haven't really seen too much of an interest in that, which is really interesting because you would think like there's a lot of like oils, potions, things they form a huge part of traditional witchcraft, but there's never been a an alchemical commentary from a traditional witchcraft author as far as I can think of, which is
well,
interesting about.
what's interesting is you look at the paintings in the Splendor Solis series, and what piqued my interest was Egyptologist Dr. Alison Roberts, in her book My Mother, My Heart. In the end of the book, she starts talking about, and this is a trained Egyptologist,
Hmm.
she fully believes that there was a transfer of information into a chemical text
Hmm.
from late period ancient pharaonic Egypt. And she points specifically to Splendor Solis. So I started looking closely at it. I thought, well, with my training in hermetics and having a good understanding of Egyptian magic and knowing a lot about European folkloric practices, is there a connection?
Hmm.
And sure enough, you can see it. If you look at each painting, you can see the symbolism there. Whoever did this, whoever painted these series, had access to virtually all three systems
Hmm.
and put it in highly, highly symbolic form. And so I started going through every single one, going, okay, what does this berry mean? What does this symbol mean? What does it mean? Why is it here? And you'll find it's pretty fascinating. And so I've been working on that for years. My wife has been pushing me. She says, you got to get that out. It's really good. And I keep picking away at it. So
Well,
but the
let
implications
me know when you do because I absolutely want to get that. That'd be
well, the implications are pretty critical because we
yeah,
thought Egyptian teachings were gone.
yeah.
But occultists have always maintained that the roots of magic come from Egypt, and
Mm.
academics say no, it's no. But now here comes along an academic saying, "Hey, wait a minute, it did come from
Yeah,
Egypt," and so I'm pretty excited about that.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's gonna be very interesting. All right. Well, Kerry, thank you so much for coming on again. It's been wonderful to talk to you.
Yep, thank you. I really enjoyed it, and thanks for coming on so late at night to talk to me. So I
All right.
appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.